Hello, and welcome to the Health Data Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Jenny Owens. And this week, we're going to do a deep dive on some AI regulations, both in the EU and at home in the US, where I am. We're going to talk about what the regulations are really focused on. We're going to talk about some takeaways from you as you're building your AI governance in your healthcare system. Let's get started. Full disclosure, I'm studying for an AI governance certification right now. So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about legal frameworks for evaluating artificial intelligence, which means that I've been doing some diving on the relevant legislation, both in the EU and in the US. For the EU, I've been focused on both the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, also the EU AI Act. And then in the States, I've been doing some reading on previous executive orders from administrations around guidance for artificial intelligence, and then some state-based legislation as well. So according to GDPR, if you're going to do data analysis, the servers have to be in the European Economic Area, which I thought was really interesting. So it's not like you can set up an AI company in the United States and expect that to travel over to Europe without also being able to physically place hardware in the European Economic Area. The principles that govern GDPR are your usual suspects like data minimization, transparency and explainability, and data protection, right? We see these a lot in our AI governance ethics perspectives. But more interesting, they've also got limitations like purpose limitation. So data collected for a specific purpose cannot be reused for other purposes without additional explicit consent, which really limits the amount that you're able to do with your data. It's fascinating. There's also restrictions limiting the amount of automated decision-making that can be done to an individual. This is actually a direct quote. The data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her, or similarly significantly affects him or her. So we have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing unless I specifically consented to that. That's really interesting, especially in the healthcare space, because you're thinking about all the different ways in which artificial intelligence can bear on your care, right? There's constantly risk prediction algorithms and, all sorts of things happening in the background. But in the healthcare ecosystem as it is today, all of that still has medical professional judgment as the final step. So these are algorithms, these are tools that are surfacing information from the medical record and presenting it to the appropriate clinician to say, well, here's the information, here's my calculations. What do you think? Use your best human judgment. So that's pretty interesting. GDPR also gives you the right to be forgotten, which is interesting. The ability to basically opt out and say, I don't want my data in this. I don't want my information to be used for these purposes, which it asserts a level of ownership over the data that we have very few mechanisms to do effectively here in the United States. The EU AI Act is really aimed at preventing algorithmic discrimination. So it prohibits a bunch of things, including a lot of law enforcement type stuff. So no untargeted scraping of the internet or of CCTV material to do facial recognition databases. It prohibits emotional recognition in workplaces and education institutions, which I think is really interesting. There was a company recently that was doing a lot of voice stuff that it was able to determine voice prints as a biomarker for depression. And there were a lot of questions about well, how does this really work if you're using it in the workplace, right? Is that something that's going to open me up to discrimination? The EU AI Act also prevents real-time biometric identification for law enforcement purposes. The EU AI Act also calls out high-risk areas, kind of differentiates AI into different tranches of risk. And it calls out high-risk areas as the areas that pose serious risks to your health, your safety, or your fundamental rights, which means that, of course, healthcare is in this more highly regulated bucket. When we're in this bucket, we have obligations. We have obligations to do adequate risk assessment and mitigation. So we have to have our eyes open about the risk that our AI is posing to our patients and to our caregivers. And we have to have a plan. We have to have a system for mitigating that risk. We have an obligation to ensure that our data that we're feeding our algorithms is high quality, that's going to minimize the risks of discriminatory outcomes. We have the obligation to log our activity to ensure that our results are traceable. So we have to document. How was this algorithm trained? What was the data set that it was trained on? What were its performance metrics? How do we know that it was doing what we wanted it to do? We're also required to do additional documentation to provide all the information necessary on the system and to make sure that that we are capable of auditing whether it is in compliance with the regulations. We're required to produce clear and adequate information to the person who's deploying it. The person who develops the system and the person who deploys the system, not always the same person. And we're also required to document appropriate human oversight measures, right? So when do we fail over to a human being and their human judgment? And when do we continue on our automation path? We're also required to make sure that we are preserving our security, that our data is secure, that our systems are secure, and that our output is accurate. So this is all interesting, right? These are good, logical, reasonable principles that derive from the ethical principles that we most frequently talk about when we talk about artificial intelligence, right? We talk about fairness. We talk about transparency and explainability. We talk about the need to make sure that your data is secure, that your algorithms are not acting in ways that are unexpected or that are going to introduce additional bias into the system, and that your system is set up to appropriately use the algorithms so that you don't end up with algorithmic bias. In the US, things are a little different. We've been wavering a little bit on our regulation. President Biden had Biden-era executive orders that called for collaboration and guidance and training to minimize harm. President Trump actually issued an executive order that ordered a review of all policies that were taken under the previous executive order to identify any actions, any policies, any guidance that was identified as a barrier to America's global AI dominance, and to have that come under special review just to make sure that our desire to proceed responsibly with artificial intelligence is not interfering with our desire to proceed responsibly with artificial intelligence. So in the absence of strong federal legislation, you end up deferring to the states, and a patchwork of regulation, proposed regulation mostly across states, has arisen, which makes standardization and interstate business a little bit more complicated. Colorado right now has the first AI bill that was actually signed by the governor, which has really complex compliance requirements. It's very open to interpretation on what a substantial factor is or what constitutes a consequential decision. There was actually a task force. So Colorado's governor signed the bill and then said, guys, this is really complicated. Can I get a task force together to give me some more specific advice on how we're actually going to implement this? How are we going to enforce this legislation? That bill met for a year. Or not that bill. Blech. That task force met for a year. They were there to review the bill after it was signed. It will go into effect in 2026. They were able to recommend a lot of improvements, but even this group was not able to come up with a definition of a substantial factor. So our legislation that is on the books right now in the states and is proposed in the states is really open to interpretation. So what does this mean for us today in healthcare? We have the benefit of being already a highly regulated environment. So the HIPAA and high tech and all sorts of legislation already really strictly govern what we can and cannot do with our data. So whenever we have a doubt, relying on that framework and the principles that underlie that framework is always a safe bet, right? So respecting patient privacy, respecting patient autonomy, making sure that what we're doing is clearly explainable to patients, that we're using data for purposes that are reasonable. Knowing your current legal environment, absolutely an excellent first step. A great second step is to make friends with lawyers who want to talk to you about it. That's also really helpful. Seeking counsel either officially or colloquially, always a good idea. Make sure when you have a chance that you're documenting the guiding principles that are driving your artificial intelligence in healthcare, that you're documenting your use cases for those AI tools, right? Where does this make sense? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? What are the metrics? How will we know? What are the data sources that we're inputting? Are we sure that those are the best data? Are they reliable? Are they complete? Document everything about the model. What is the data? How is it trained? What is the purpose for which we want to use this? Who's receiving the output? In what setting? What action are we hoping they're going to take? And then making a plan for failing over, right? Just like you would for data security. When you have data stored on a server and your server goes down, do you have a failover plan? When you're relying on an algorithm and the algorithm goes down, what is your plan for replacing that with straight human judgment from start to finish, as opposed to human judgment just at the finish line? If you're at all interested in this, if you've got tips and tricks, if you have additional thoughts, I would love to hear from you. I think this is a really fascinating, evolving area. AI legislation, really interesting to me. I always think about, and this is really going to show my age, I always think about the dawn of the internet, right? When we had this senator who was speaking in front of the Senate about the internet being a series of tubes and how it's not like a truck. And one of his interns had sent him some internet that day and it couldn't get there because the tubes were jammed. I have a lot of respect and faith in our elected representatives. They're not always great at understanding technology. And so the bills that get drafted by people who don't use this technology, by people who don't necessarily understand all of the implications and the use cases for the technology, can end up reflecting more of our constituents' fears than our constituents' opportunities. So I also think that we have maybe not an obligation, but maybe an opportunity to talk with our elected officials and say, hey, yes, absolutely, we should be worried about, fully autonomous weaponized artificial intelligence, but can we also think about all of the ways in which AI can help us? Let's think about drafting legislation that makes it more possible to do more of this.